The Void Court had not gathered like this in 3,000 cycles. Across the vastness of space, the most powerful beings in the galaxy began to materialize one by one. Their forms flickered into existence around an enormous crystalline chamber that floated in the darkness between stars. Some appeared as clouds of sentient energy, others as massive armored creatures with too many limbs to count. There were beings made of pure thought, their consciousness visible as shimmering waves of light. Ancient warlords stood beside hive minds that controlled entire star systems. Each one commanded fleets, ruled planets, and shaped the destinies of billions. But today, none of that mattered. Every single one of them, regardless of their power or pride, turned their attention to the center of the chamber. Something impossible was happening on the central platform, and they could all feel it in their bones, their cores, their very essence. The air itself seemed heavy with dread. Vexcolor the Eternal was dying. The name alone should have been enough to make the assembled beings pause. Vexcolor was not just any dragon. He was the dragon, a living legend who had existed longer than most civilizations. While empires rose and fell like waves on a shore, he endured. While species evolved and went extinct, he remained. He had been ancient when the oldest beings in this room were still learning to walk. Some said he had witnessed the birth of stars. Others whispered that he had seen galaxies collide and reform. No one knew his true age, but 50,000 years was the most conservative estimate. The dragon's massive body stretched across the platform, nearly 200 meters from his enormous horned head to the tip of his spiked tail. To see him was to understand just how small and fragile most life in the universe truly was. His scales, which normally shimmered with the deep purple-black color of the void between stars, now looked dull and lifeless. They had lost their luster, like jewels covered in dust. Energy still crackled across his form in weak bursts of lightning, but it was nothing like the devastating power he once commanded. Instead of the bright plasma that could tear through starship hulls, there were only feeble sparks that flickered and died almost immediately. His 3 eyes, each one larger than a grown human, had always been his most terrifying feature. Those eyes could see across dimensions, peer through time, and strip away every lie and secret. They glowed with an inner fire that had once reduced mighty warriors to trembling children. But now, those same eyes had dimmed to pale embers, barely glowing at all. They looked almost gray, like dying coals in a forgotten fireplace. Vexcolor's breathing was labored. Each breath caused his massive ribcage to rise and fall with visible effort. The sound echoed through the chamber like distant thunder, slow and painful. His wings, which could create storms when he flew and blot out the sun of entire worlds, lay folded against his sides, limp and powerless. The Hive Empress of Zarketh, a creature that commanded trillions of individual drones across 12 planets, leaned forward with her multifaceted eyes gleaming. She had never seen weakness in the dragon before. No one had. The Quantum Collective, a sphere of pure energy representing thousands of merged minds, pulsed with barely contained shock. Even the warlord Prince Kordax, whose 4 arms had conquered more systems than he could count, stood frozen in disbelief. His battle-scarred chest, covered in the trophies of 100 wars, rose and fell with uncertain breath. A low rumble began to build in Vexcolor's chest. It started deep, like an earthquake forming in the planet's core, and slowly rose until it became words. When the dragon spoke, his voice was a subsonic roar that made the very fabric of reality shiver. The translation devices worn by most beings in the chamber struggled to keep up. "The human," Vexcolor said, each word an effort. Smoke curled from his nostrils as he spoke. "I require the human." The chamber fell into absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop, if pins existed that could survive in this place. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, all at once, chaos erupted. Voices rose in every language, every frequency. Beings who had remained calm in the face of galactic wars were now shouting over each other. "Impossible!" The Hive Empress's mandibles clicked together in rapid agitation, creating a sound like shattering glass. Her entire body vibrated with disbelief. The protected species Accord specifically forbids. Vexcalor's eyes flashed with a brief spark of his old power, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I know the Accord," he interrupted, and despite his weakened state, there was still command in his voice. "I helped write that document 5,000 years before your species discovered fire, Empress. I sat at the table when we decided which young civilizations would be protected from the greed of the elder races. I remember every word." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I do not ask to conquer them. I do not ask to enslave them or study them like insects. I ask to petition one of them, to request their help." Then, something happened that no one in the galaxy had ever witnessed. Something that would be talked about in hushed whispers for generations to come. Vexcalor the Eternal, the dragon who had scattered entire invasion fleets with a roar, who had negotiated peace treaties as an equal to the most powerful beings in existence, who had turned armies to ash with a single breath, slowly lowered his massive head. It was a gesture of submission, of humility, of desperate need. His horn skull, which had smashed through the bridges of warships, touched the cold crystal floor of the chamber. Minji had always thought that the worst thing that could happen during her graduate program was failing her thesis defense. She was wrong. Very wrong. The worst thing was actually trying to keep a dying garden alive on a student budget while the station's life support systems kept breaking down every other week. And right now, she was living that nightmare. The atmospheric processor in New Kinshasa Station's lower research levels had given up the ghost again. It was the third time this month. Minji was elbow-deep in its guts, her hands covered in grease and nutrient solution, trying to coax the ancient machine back to life. The processor was supposed to regulate air quality and temperature for her experimental garden where she grew modified earth plants. Without it, months of work would die within hours. She couldn't afford to lose another crop. Her advisor was already making noises about her lack of progress. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she worked. The lower levels were always hot, always humid, and always smelled faintly of recycled air and old metal. Her coveralls, which had been clean that morning, were now stained with dark patches of hydraulic fluid and soil. Her hair, pulled back in a messy bun, kept falling into her face no matter how many times she pushed it away. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, tapping the side of the processor with her wrench. "Just work for one more week. That's all I'm asking." The machine gurgled in response, which was not encouraging. That's when her communicator went absolutely insane. The small device clipped to her belt started buzzing so violently that it nearly vibrated right off. The sound was unlike anything she'd heard before, not the normal ping of a message or even the urgent buzz of a station emergency. This was a screaming, wailing alarm that made her jump and crack her head on the underside of the processor. Ow! She grabbed her communicator, ready to silence whatever spam call had decided to ruin her day. But when she looked at the screen, her blood ran cold. Priority 1 Galactic Emergency. Government Encryption Level 17. Immediate response required. Her first thought was that it had to be a mistake. She was nobody. Just a 24-year-old grad student from Earth who spent her days playing with plants and fighting with broken equipment. She didn't get messages from the government. She barely got messages from her own department. Her second thought was that maybe the station was under attack. But no alarms were going off, and people would be running and screaming if that were the case. The hallway outside her lab was quiet except for the usual hum of ventilation systems. She tapped the screen with a greasy finger, leaving a smudge. The message was brief and terrifying in its simplicity. Report to Conference Chamber Alpha immediately. This is not optional. Transport has been arranged. Minji looked down at herself. She was a mess. Her coveralls had stains on top of stains. Her hands were black with grime. She probably smelled like a combination of machine oil and compost. "I need to change," she said to no one in particular. But before she could move, her lab door slid open with a hiss. 2 security officers in crisp uniforms stood there, looking very official and very impatient. "Miss Minji," the taller one asked. That's me, but I really need to. No time. Come with us, please. The please sounded more like an order than a request. Minji glanced back at her dying processor, at her wilting plants, at the chaos of her small research space. Everything she'd worked for was in this room. But the looks on the officers' faces told her that arguing would be pointless. 20 minutes later, Minji found herself standing in a conference room she didn't even know existed on the station. It was enormous, with walls that seemed to be made of liquid crystal, constantly shifting and flowing with patterns of light. The ceiling stretched up so high she couldn't see the top. And floating all around her, like ghosts made of light, were holographic projections of beings she had only seen in textbooks and documentaries. Her legs felt weak. She recognized the Hive Empress of Zarketh from the distinctive clicking patterns of her mandibles. That massive four-armed figure had to be one of the warlord princes from the Crimson Expanse. And that sphere of pulsing energy was definitely a quantum collective node. These were beings that shaped galactic policy. They decided which civilizations got access to hyperspace lanes and which ones stayed isolated. They commanded armies, controlled resources that could buy entire planets, and lived for thousands of years. And here was Minji, standing among them in dirty coveralls, with soil under her fingernails and a smudge of hydraulic fluid on her cheek. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to wake up and find out this was all some kind of stress dream brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. But the hard floor beneath her boots felt very real. The slight hum of the holographic projectors felt very real. And the weight of dozens of eyes from beings across the galaxy all focused on her felt extremely, uncomfortably real. A figure materialized at the center of the room. It was crystalline, refracting light into colors that didn't have names in any human language. The Void Court Chancellor. Minji had seen exactly one news clip about this being in her entire life, during a major treaty signing 3 years ago. And now it was here, and it was looking directly at her. Miss Minji, the Chancellor began, its voice like wind chimes made of diamonds. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have been requested by name. By Vexcolor the Eternal. Minji's brain tried to process those words and failed spectacularly. Vexcolor. The dragon. The one from history lessons and legends. The being who was older than human civilization. The creature that could destroy a starship with a thought. I'm sorry, what? It was the only thing her shocked brain could produce. The Ancient One is dying, the Chancellor continued, as if it was explaining something simple like the weather. He has refused all assistance from the galaxy's finest healers, our most advanced medical technology, and our greatest minds. He will accept help from only one being. You. Minji looked around the room, certain they had grabbed the wrong person. There had to be another Minji somewhere. A famous scientist Minji. A legendary healer Minji. Literally any other Minji but her. Are you sure you have the right person? I'm a xenobiology student. I study plants. I grow things in dirt. I'm not a doctor. The Hive Empress leaned forward, her hologram flickering slightly. He was quite specific. He spoke your full name, your research focus, even your current project on Terran plant adaptation to low-gravity environments. He knows exactly who you are. But I've never met him. I've never even been off the station, except to visit Earth twice. How does he even know I exist? The Chancellor's form dimmed slightly, which Minji had learned in her xenobiology classes, was the crystalline species version of a shrug. We do not know. But he has been watching you. For how long, we cannot say. The journey to Vexcolor's sanctuary took 3 days, but it felt like stepping outside of time itself. Minji sat in the diplomatic shuttle, watching space fold and unfold around her in ways that made her head hurt if she thought about it too long. Her escort, a tall being named Teshvar with silver skin and eyes like liquid mercury, sat across from her in patient silence. He seemed content to let her process everything at her own pace. Minji couldn't stop thinking about how surreal this all was. A week ago, her biggest worry was whether she could afford new soil samples. Now she was traveling through folded space to meet a dying dragon who somehow knew her name. She tried asking Teshvar questions during the first day, but he claimed to know as little as she did. Vexcolor had simply requested her and refused to explain why. On the third day, they dropped out of hyperspace, and Minji got her first look at the sanctuary. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed both hands against the viewport, her face nearly touching the transparent metal, trying to take it all in. The sanctuary existed in a pocket of folded space, anchored somehow to a dying red giant star. The star itself was enormous, bloated and dim, casting everything in a warm amber glow that reminded Minji of late autumn afternoons back on Earth. But it wasn't the star that made her stare and wonder. It was everything floating around it. Thousands upon thousands of structures drifted in the void, each one different from the last. There were buildings that looked like they were grown rather than built, with organic curves and spiraling towers. Others were geometric and precise, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry. Some glowed with their own internal light. Others seemed to absorb light, creating patches of deeper darkness against the star's glow. "What are those?" Minji whispered, though there was no need to whisper. The shuttle was empty, except for her and Teshvar. "Memorials," Teshvar replied quietly. His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Every structure you see is dedicated to a civilization that no longer exists." Minji felt something cold settle in her stomach. She counted the structures visible from her viewport. 50, 100, 200. And those were just the ones she could see. There had to be thousands more behind them, stretching out into the distance until they blurred together. All of these, they're all extinct. Teshvar nodded slowly. Every single one. Some died in wars. Others from plagues, environmental collapse, cosmic disasters. Some simply faded away as their birth rates dropped and their people grew tired of living. A few destroyed themselves. Each one represents an entire species, an entire culture, an entire way of seeing the universe that will never exist again. As the shuttle moved closer, Minji could make out more details. One structure looked like a massive temple with columns that seemed to be made of frozen music, if such a thing were possible. Another resembled a library, its walls covered in symbols she couldn't read. There was a garden suspended between 3 asteroids, filled with plants that glowed in colors she'd never seen before. A school, its playground equipment still visible through transparent walls. A concert hall, a museum, a home. He built all of these. Minji asked, her voice barely audible. "Every single one," Teshvar confirmed. "When a civilization dies, when the last member of a species takes their final breath, Vexcolor creates a memorial. He gathers artifacts, records, art, literature, music, anything he can preserve. Then he builds them a monument here, in his sanctuary. Some of these structures are 50,000 years old. Others were built within the last century." Minji did some quick math in her head and felt dizzy. But that means he's been doing this for his entire life. He's spent 50,000 years watching species die and building monuments to remember them. "Yes. That's not just remembering," Minji said softly, her eyes still fixed on the endless array of memorials floating past. "That's grief. He's been carrying 50,000 years of grief." Teshvar turned to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something like surprise in his liquid silver. For the first 2 days, Minji simply sat with the dragon and talked. It felt strange at first, sitting cross-legged on a floating platform in the middle of space, having a conversation with a being who had lived longer than human civilization. But Vexcolor didn't want grand speeches or scientific presentations. He just wanted to listen to her story. So she talked about Earth. She told him about growing up in a small apartment in Seoul where her family kept a tiny balcony garden. How her mother would grow tomatoes in old paint buckets and herbs in whatever containers they could find. How that little patch of green in the middle of a concrete city had been her first introduction to the magic of making things grow. She described the smell of the soil after rain, the satisfaction of picking the first ripe tomato of the season, the disappointment when pests destroyed their cucumber plants. Vexcolor listened without interrupting, his massive head resting on his coiled body, those 3 ancient eyes focused entirely on her. Sometimes he would close his eyes, and Minji wondered if he was imagining what she described. A dragon who had seen galaxies collide, picturing a small human child watering tomato plants on a balcony. On the third day, she told him about her grandmother. The memory still hurt, even though it had been 5 years since she passed. Her grandmother had lived through the climate wars, those terrible decades when resources grew scarce and nations fought over water and arable land. She'd spent 3 years in a refugee camp after rising sea levels swallowed her coastal village. The camp was awful, Minji explained, her voice soft. Thousands of people crammed together. Not enough food, not enough clean water, disease everywhere. People were angry and scared and losing hope every single day. My grandmother told me that every morning she would wake up and wonder if that would be the day she gave up. But she didn't. Vexcolor rumbled, his voice like distant thunder.
No.
She didn't. Because one day, she found a packet of flower seeds in the pocket of an old jacket. Marigolds. She had no idea how long they'd been there. They probably weren't even viable anymore. But she planted them anyway, in a cracked ceramic cup she'd found in the trash. She used a precious portion of her daily water ration to keep the soil moist. Minji smiled at the memory of her grandmother telling this story, her wrinkled hands moving expressively as she spoke. Everyone thought she was crazy. People were starving, and she was wasting water on flowers. But 3 weeks later, a tiny green shoot pushed through the soil. And 2 weeks after that, it bloomed. Just one small orange marigold in the middle of all that suffering. What happened then? The dragon's eyes seemed brighter, more focused. People started coming to look at it. At first just 1 or 2, then dozens. They would stand in line just to see this one flower. Some of them cried. My grandmother said it reminded them that beautiful things could still exist, that life could still grow even in the worst circumstances. Within a month, other people started planting seeds too. Anywhere they could find soil or make soil. The camp started to transform. It was still hard, still painful, but there was color now. There was life. Vexcolor was quiet for a long moment. One flower changed everything. One stubborn old woman who refused to give up changed everything, Minji corrected gently. The flower was just a seed. She was the hope. Over the next few days, Minji began working with the memorial gardens while they talked. She brought her tools from the shuttle, simple things that looked almost primitive compared to the advanced technology floating all around them. But Vexcolor watched with fascination as she examined the plants he'd been maintaining for centuries. She showed him her research data on her portable terminal. Not the polished presentations she'd shown to academic committees, but the real work. The messy spreadsheets full of failures. The photos of experiments gone wrong. The plants that withered despite her best efforts. The mutations that didn't work. The ideas that seemed brilliant in theory but failed spectacularly in practice. This one, she said, pulling up an image of a completely dead plant, brown and crispy. I spent 6 months developing this variety. It was supposed to grow in low light conditions. I was so sure I'd figured it out. And then I tested it, and it died in 3 days. That must have been devastating, Vexcolor observed. Minji shrugged. It was frustrating. I definitely cried. Maybe threw my tablet across the lab. But then I analyzed why it failed, adjusted my approach, and tried again. And again. And again. On the 7th attempt, I got a plant that survived for 2 weeks. On the 15th attempt, I got one that's still alive 2 years later. She pulled up another file, showing a healthy plant with unusual dark green leaves. This is what 15 failures taught me. Each dead plant was a lesson. Each mistake showed me something new about how these organisms work. The dragon shifted his enormous bulk, energy crackling weakly along his scales. Your species has existed for what I consider an eye blink in cosmic time. Humans have been traveling in space for barely 2 centuries. You face extinction events regularly. Disease, war, environmental collapse, cosmic threats. Yet you persist. How do you maintain such resilience? Minji thought about that question for a moment, really considered it. Because we have to, she finally said. We don't have the luxury of eternal life like you do. We don't have 50,000 years to figure things out. Most of us get maybe 80 or 90 years if we're lucky. We're not ancient and powerful. We're just people trying to make it to tomorrow. She gestured at the memorial gardens around them. You remember every species you've lost. You carry all that history, all that pain. It's beautiful and terrible. But we humans, we're different. We're not trying to preserve what was. We're trying to build what could be. 3 months had passed since Minji first arrived at the sanctuary. 3 months of work, of conversation, of slowly watching a dying god come back to life. And now, the Void Court had assembled once again, this time not in emergency session, but in celebration and confusion. Nobody quite understood what had happened, only that the impossible had occurred. The massive crystalline chamber hummed with anticipation as the assembled powers of the galaxy waited. The same beings who had gathered months ago to witness Vexcolor's slow death were now here to see something they never expected. Holographic projections flickered in the air as representatives from 1,000 worlds tuned in to watch. This was going to be the most talked-about event in recent galactic history. The chamber doors opened with a sound like singing crystal, and absolute silence fell. Vexcolor the Eternal entered, and he was magnificent. His scales gleamed with that deep purple-black shimmer that looked like the void between stars had been polished to perfection. Each scale caught the light and reflected it in colors that shouldn't exist. Bright plasma crackled and danced along his form in controlled, powerful bursts. Not the weak, dying sparks from before, but genuine lightning that made the air smell of ozone and possibility. His 3 eyes burned with ancient fire, glowing with an intensity that made some of the assembled beings look away. They were seeing the dragon as he had been in his prime, perhaps even stronger. But there was something different about him now. Something the older beings in the chamber noticed immediately. Yes, he had the terrible power and majesty they remembered from ages past. But there was something else too, something new in the way he moved and held himself. A gentleness. A warmth, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He didn't just look alive. He looked like he wanted to be alive. Beside him, looking absolutely tiny in comparison, walked a young human woman. Minji had traded her stained coveralls for formal ambassador robes in deep blue, though anyone who looked closely could see she was wearing her same comfortable work boots underneath. Her hair was neatly arranged for once, though a few stubborn strands still escaped to frame her face. She walked with her head high, not intimidated by the gathered powers around her, though her hands betrayed her nervousness by occasionally smoothing the fabric of her robes. The Hive Empress of Zarketh was the first to break the silence. Her multifaceted eyes gleamed with barely contained curiosity as her mandibles clicked together in rapid patterns. The human succeeded where all our science failed. Where our greatest healers, our most advanced technology, our oldest wisdom could not help. How is this possible? Vexcolor's laugh was like rolling thunder across a summer sky, deep and warm and filled with genuine joy. The sound made the crystal walls of the chamber vibrate in harmonics. Several beings who had known the dragon for millennia exchanged shocked glances. They couldn't remember the last time they'd heard him laugh like that. She reminded me of something I had forgotten over 50,000 years, the dragon said, his voice filling the chamber with that subsonic rumble that made everyone's bones vibrate. Preservation alone is death. Holding on to the past, no matter how beautiful or important that past was, will eventually kill you. Life requires growth. It requires change. It requires taking risks and facing the possibility of loss. He looked down at Minji with unmistakable fondness. She showed me that hope is not the belief that nothing bad will happen. Hope is not the naive expectation that we won't lose things we love. True hope is the determination to create beauty despite loss. It's the stubborn insistence that tomorrow is worth building even when today is painful. The warlord Prince Kordax leaned forward, his 4 arms crossed over his massive chest. Battle scars crisscrossed his armor, each one a story from his long military career. But what did she actually do? What treatment? What technology? What ancient knowledge did she possess? Minji spoke up for the first time, her voice smaller than the dragon's but clear and strong. I didn't treat him. I'm not a doctor. I just talked to him and helped him garden. A ripple of confusion spread through the assembly. The quantum collective pulsed with agitated energy, its sphere flickering through several colors. Gardening? You saved the most powerful being in the galaxy with gardening. Not just gardening, Vexcolor interjected gently. She gave me something to build toward, something to hope for, something that made the future worth living to see. The dragon's form shimmered, and suddenly the chamber was filled with holographic projections. The images showed the sanctuary, but transformed. The memorial gardens were no longer static monuments to the dead. They were alive with activity. Research stations floated among the ancient structures. Students from dozens of species worked side by side, studying the preserved knowledge of extinct civilizations. Gardens that had once held only carefully maintained remnants now burst with hybrid plants, combining genetics from worlds that had never met. Scientists analyzed data. Artists created new works inspired by old cultures. Historians cataloged and shared stories that had nearly been lost forever. The sanctuary of eternal growth, Minji announced, and despite her nervousness, there was pride in her voice. A living archive and research center, open to all species. Vexcolor has agreed to share his 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge. Every piece of art, literature, science, and culture he's preserved from extinct civilizations. And we're not just preserving it. We're building on it. She pulled up more images, showing gardens where plants from dead worlds were being cross-pollinated with species from living ones. We're creating new things from old knowledge, honoring the past by letting it inspire the future. We have scientists working on medical techniques that combine ancient healing practices with modern technology. Artists blending musical traditions from civilizations separated by millennia. Botanists like me developing crops that could feed billions by combining genetic traits from a dozen extinct plant species. The Hive Empress clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. This is unprecedented. Access to such knowledge could change everything. That's the point, Vexcolor rumbled. For too long, I hoarded this knowledge like a miser hoards gold. I thought I was honoring the dead by keeping their memories perfect and untouched. But Minji showed me that the best way to honor them is to let their legacy live and grow and change. To let it become part of something new. But the quantum collective wasn't finished with its questions. Its sphere pulsed brighter. This still doesn't explain your recovery. The sanctuary is remarkable, but how did it cure you? Vexcolor's eyes seemed to glow even brighter. My species cannot reproduce, without hope for the future. Our children are literally born from our belief in tomorrow. For 8,000 years, no dragon has successfully laid an egg because none of us could truly believe the future was worth bringing a child into. We had lost faith. The dragon's voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. 3 days ago, for the first time in 8 millennia, something happened. Another hologram appeared, and the entire chamber gasped as one. Floating in the center of the image was an egg. Not very large, perhaps the size of a human, but perfect. Its shell glowed with soft internal light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. It rested in a specially designed nest made of hybrid flowers from Minji's gardens, surrounded by careful temperature controls and monitoring equipment. The chamber erupted into chaos.